Before Emily looked twice at that tourist on the beach in the Maldives, before the betrayal, before the silence in the airport terminal when I walked away from her for good, we were just Alan and Emily. A couple that clawed our way up from small-town roots to a life that looked a lot shinier on Instagram than it felt in person. We lived in a modest but tidy townhouse just outside of Denver. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a little garden that Emily tried to keep alive and I tried to avoid mowing. She taught 3rd grade at the local school and I managed logistics for a shipping company. Nothing glamorous, but stable. Predictable. And honestly, I used to think that was a good thing. Our day-to-day life was clockwork. Wake up at 6, coffee by 6:30, both out the door by 7:15. Weeknights meant leftovers, a show we half-watched while scrolling on our phones, and sometimes, just sometimes, she'd reach out for my hand during a movie. That meant more than I let on. It was the kind of routine that could dull the edges of a relationship if you let it. But we didn't. Or so I thought. We saved every spare dime for vacations. It was our thing. We didn't eat out much, didn't upgrade our cars, didn't splurge on the latest gadgets. Instead, we hoarded airline miles and tracked hotel deals like hawks. Emily made spreadsheets. I pretended not to care until I saw the final numbers and nodded like I had anything to add. We made it to Greece, Costa Rica, Thailand, and finally the Maldives. That trip took us 2 years to save for. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of our travels. Emily called it her dream trip and I took pride in making it happen. I remember sitting at the airport, passports in hand, watching her glow under the fluorescent lights of Gate 24. She looked happy. I was sure of it. We landed in Mail and took one of those tiny propeller planes to a private island resort that cost more per night than our mortgage. Overwater bungalows, glass floors where you could watch fish swim beneath your feet, and a minibar that made me question if water was ever worth $10. But we smiled. We swam. We took photos. For 3 days, I believed this was everything we'd worked for. Then came the 4th day. I remember the sun was brutal that morning, even under the shade of our cabana. Emily had that red bikini she knew drove me crazy, the one she usually saved for pools where no students or parents might bump into her. She was lounging on a beach chair, sunglasses perched low, pretending to read a book but really watching something over the top of her pages. Or rather, someone. He was tall, tan, probably European, you could tell by the way he wore a scarf with no shirt like it was the most natural thing in the world. He had that look, the kind of guy who doesn't sweat and somehow smells like expensive wood. I noticed her noticing him. And then I noticed how long she noticed. My stomach didn't drop right away. No. It was more like a whisper in my gut, something that said, "Hey, you seen this?" I told myself it was nothing. A fluke. I even teased her about it later, half-joking, testing the waters. "That guy with the scarf, you get his number yet?" She laughed too hard. "Touch my arm. Please." But that night, she was quiet. She claimed she had a headache and went to bed early. And I sat out on the little bungalow porch, watching the waves, sipping the minibar whiskey, and trying not to think. Over the next 2 days, the pattern continued. Glances. Giggling with him at the beach bar. Just going for a walk. Except her walks got longer and she started leaving her phone behind. That, more than anything, told me what I didn't want to admit. I didn't explode. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. Instead, I watched. I listened. And I made a plan. Because if she was going to throw away everything we built over a man whose name she probably couldn't even pronounce, then fine. She could have him. She just wouldn't have me. So I waited until our final morning. I packed my bag before she woke up. Left her a note, "You always said you wanted to stay in paradise. Now you can." And I walked away. No return ticket for her. No forwarding address. Just a one-way goodbye, paid in full with every hour I worked to get us here. Walking away wasn't easy. Don't let the dramatic flair of a handwritten note fool you. My hand was shaking when I folded the paper and slipped it under her sunglasses. I looked back once. She was still curled under the white hotel duvet, mouth slightly open, blissfully unaware that her world was about to shrink to one tiny, sun-bleached island. I didn't look back again. The seaplane ride back to the mainland was quiet. Just me, 2 honeymooners who couldn't keep their hands off each other, and an older German couple that didn't speak a lick of English. I envied them all in different ways. I spent the first 2 hours at the airport pretending to browse souvenirs I had no intention of buying. Then I found a corner seat by the departure gate and pulled out my phone. No texts. No calls. Not yet. She probably hadn't even seen the note. By the time I boarded my flight home, I knew I wouldn't hear from her until she was standing at the resort's front desk asking about a return ticket. That would be when the panic would set in. That's when she'd realize I was gone and not just for the day. Back home in Denver, the silence was loud. I dropped my bag by the door, stared at the wall for longer than I cared to admit, and then went straight to the bedroom. Her dresser was still full. Her favorite coffee mug still on the shelf. I took a long breath and told myself I didn't need to cry. I'd done enough weeping on the flight. Instead, I sat down with a legal pad and made a list. Change locks. Call the bank. Cancel her card. Talk to a lawyer. That last one hit different. It was like writing the ending to a story I didn't even know I was in. Not until now. The next morning I followed through. The locksmith showed up at noon. The card was canceled by 1. By 2, I was sitting across from a divorce attorney named Rachel Greer, who looked like she'd been through a few heartbreaks of her own. She didn't say much when I told her what happened. Just nodded slowly and said, "We'll get you through this." Funny how 5 words from a stranger can feel more comforting than the last 2 years of my marriage. I left her office with a folder full of paperwork and a strange sense of peace. I wasn't going to scream or beg or plead. I wasn't going to go on Facebook and announce my heartbreak. I was just going to do what I always did, move forward. She still hadn't called. But 3 days later I got a text. "Emily, where are you? Are you okay?" I stared at it for a while. Then, without replying, I blocked her number. Emily woke to the sound of distant waves and the weight of silence. At first, she smiled, stretching out across the bed like a cat in a sunbeam. Vacation mornings were made for slow waking. But something felt off. The other half of the bed was cold. She glanced at the nightstand, no phone, no note, no Alan. The sliding door to the patio was closed. Maybe he was already out snorkeling or getting breakfast. She yawned, rolled over, and saw it. The note. It was scrawled in Alan's neat but hurried handwriting on the back of a receipt from the minibar. "You always said you wanted to stay in paradise. Now you can." For a moment, she thought it was a joke. She even laughed, just a quick nervous chuckle. But then she read it again. And again. Each time the words sank deeper, like pebbles in a tide pool. She jumped up and checked the closet. His suitcase was gone. So was his passport. By the time she made it to the front desk, still barefoot and clutching a towel like a shield, the concierge confirmed what she feared. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Carson checked out early this morning. He arranged his transfer last night." That was when her legs gave out. She sat on a bench under a palm tree, staring blankly at the sea. A staff member brought her a bottle of water and asked if she needed anything. Emily shook her head. She needed a time machine. Emily spent the next hour sitting on that bench, watching the turquoise water roll in like it had any sympathy for her. The sun rose higher, and the warmth that usually felt like heaven now just burned. Reality came in waves, and none of them were gentle. She didn't cry. Not right away. That would come later. Instead, she just sat stunned, hollow, clutching that scrap of paper like it might change if she stared long enough. Eventually, she made her way back to the bungalow. Staff had already begun tidying up around the resort. Emily walked barefoot across the polished wood floors, feeling like a ghost in her own skin. Everything she and Alan had packed neatly was still there, minus his things. The toothbrush, gone. His navy blue swim trunks, gone. The cologne she bought him for Christmas, gone. She stood in the doorway of the bathroom, trying to convince herself this was a misunderstanding. A test, maybe. Something Alan would pull just to teach her a lesson. But deep down, she knew better. She knew him. He never raised his voice. Never made threats. But he remembered. He watched. He waited. And when he moved, it was final. She picked up her phone, no service. The resort's Wi-Fi barely reached the rooms, so she had to walk to the main lounge to connect. When she finally got a signal, her fingers trembled as she opened her messages. Nothing from Alan. She typed, deleted, retyped. "Emily, Alan. Please tell me where you are. I don't understand what's going on." Message sent. Then another. "Emily, I think we need to talk. I'm sorry if I hurt you. Please just let me know you're safe." No response. 2 hours later, she tried again. No answer. Then the text stopped delivering altogether. Blocked. It hit her harder than anything else. Panic bubbled up, messy and choking. Not just because she was stranded, she could eventually figure that out. But because she had finally realized something Alan already knew, she had broken something that didn't come with instructions for repair. She walked the beach aimlessly for the rest of the day. The tourist with the scarf? Gone. Probably left that morning too. She couldn't even remember his last name if he gave it. What she did remember was the rush. The laugh. The feeling of being desired again. And now? All she felt was small. By evening, Emily was sitting with the resort manager, explaining her situation with as much dignity as she could gather. "So your husband left without notice?" Yes. Did you two have an argument? She hesitated. Not really. I think I made a mistake. The manager, a kind-eyed woman named Rashida, nodded gently. We'll help you arrange a return flight. It may take a day or two. And just like that, Emily realized she had a new title. Not wife. Not guest. Just a problem to be solved. She spent that night alone in the bungalow, lights off, laying in the bed where her marriage ended. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every creak of the wind on the wood beams felt like judgment. And back in Denver? Alan was sleeping just fine. Emily boarded the seaplane back to the mainland with a loaner suitcase and a resort-issued phone number scribbled on a post-it in her wallet. Her own phone was working again, but Alan was still a ghost. No calls, no texts. The kind of silence that wasn't just loud, it was permanent. The ride to the mainland felt surreal. She stared out the tiny window as islands passed beneath them, each one a sun-drenched dot that looked like it belonged on a postcard. None of them felt like paradise anymore. She clutched her seatbelt tighter, trying to hold herself together. By the time she made it to the airport, booked a standby flight, and finally boarded her journey home, she was numb. She had plenty of time in the air, 2 layovers and more hours in cramped seats than she cared to count, to replay everything. Every smile Alan had given her, every sign she missed, every selfish little thrill she chased on that beach that now felt miles below rock bottom. When the plane finally landed in Denver, the cold air slapped her harder than any confrontation ever could. She didn't expect a welcome party, but the emptiness of baggage claim hit her differently. There was no Alan. No car. No note this time. Just the realization that she wasn't going back to her old life, she was stepping into a new one. One where she might not be forgiven. She took a cab back to their townhouse. Still said there, in her mind, out of habit. But when she got there, her key didn't work. That was the second slap of the day. She knocked. Nothing. She texted. Still blocked. Finally, a neighbor, a woman named Kathy who always waved but never really spoke, poked her head out of the window and said, "He changed the locks 2 days ago. Moved your name off the mailbox too." Emily managed a polite thank you, though her cheeks burned. Kathy shut her blinds without another word. With nowhere else to go, Emily headed to a nearby cafe and sat there for hours, nursing a lukewarm coffee and watching the snowfall. When she finally built up the nerve, she called her sister and asked for a place to stay. The next few days were a blur of silence, lawyers, and realization. Alan had filed for divorce. Papers were waiting at a courier's office. He didn't even want her to come to the door. Her name was already removed from the joint bank account. Her credit card had been frozen. He'd been efficient, methodical. A man who had loved her deeply and now loved himself enough to walk away. She thought about texting him from a different number, writing him a letter. But every time she sat down to do it, she stared at the blank page and realized, what do you even say when you're the villain in someone else's story? Meanwhile, Alan wasn't celebrating. He wasn't drinking with friends or swiping through dating apps or giving locker room speeches about how he won. He was unpacking. Not bags, but himself. The parts of him that had gone quiet during the relationship, the guy who played guitar, the one who liked to go hiking, the one who used to write in journals but stopped somewhere between the first fight about money and the third forgotten anniversary. He saw a therapist. Joined a book club, of all things. He found a gym he actually liked and showed up 3 times a week, not because he wanted revenge abs, but because he finally wanted to feel something again. Something that belonged to him. His friends were shocked at how calm he was. "You're handling this like a monk," one of them said over coffee. Alan just shrugged. "I lived in confusion for a long time. Living in clarity isn't half bad." He didn't stalk her socials. Didn't send late-night texts. Didn't wait for closure. He'd written his closure on a scrap of paper in a hotel room. And Emily? She saw the divorce go through in weeks. Alan waved spousal support. Didn't fight over furniture. Just wanted a clean break. The only thing he asked for and insisted on was that she keep her distance. No calls. No emails. No slow-burn confessions about how she'd always loved him. Because maybe she had loved him. Just not enough to stop herself when it mattered most. She saw him once, weeks later, by accident. At a farmer's market. He was standing by a stand of honey jars, smiling at something the vendor said. She stood frozen near a booth across the path, her breath catching. He looked healthier. Lighter. Like someone who had finally stopped carrying a load that wasn't his to bear. He didn't see her. Or maybe he did. But either way, he didn't stop. Alan always thought healing would look like a big, movie-worthy moment, some dramatic shedding of pain, followed by sunrise yoga and a better haircut. Turns out, healing looked more like rice and beans in a clean apartment, answering emails without flinching and sleeping through the night without wondering if your wife was really just running errands. It had been 6 weeks since he left Emily on that island. 6 weeks since he stopped pretending that the version of her he loved still existed. Some mornings, he still woke up expecting the usual, the sound of her blow dryer, her toothbrush clinking in the glass, the quiet hum of her first cup of coffee. But those mornings were fading. He had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It was nothing special, second floor, slightly crooked blinds, kitchen tiles from the late 90s, but it was his. He didn't decorate much. Just a record player in the corner, some photos of the national parks he still wanted to visit, and a growing collection of used books with cracked spines. He kept busy. Every Saturday he went hiking. Alone. He liked the silence of the trees and the sound of gravel under his boots. There was a rhythm to it that made sense. One step, then another. No lies, no detours. Just forward. One evening, after a long hike, he sat on a bench near the summit of Mount Falcon, watching the city stretch out below him. The lights flickered like they didn't know who they belonged to. He thought about what his life used to be, about vacations they took, photos framed in their hallway, the dinner parties with forced laughs and shared looks across the table. None of it felt real anymore. Like someone else's story. He pulled out his journal. Something he hadn't done in years. And he wrote, "I'm not angry anymore. Not even sad, really. Just grateful I got out before I lost more of myself. I wasn't perfect. But I showed up. I stayed when I could have left. I loved fully. And when I couldn't anymore, I walked. That has to count for something." Meanwhile, Emily was living with her sister, sleeping on a pull-out couch that groaned every time she shifted. She'd taken a leave of absence from work, originally calling it stress, but the truth was harder to swallow. She couldn't face 30 curious third graders while her own life felt like a test she kept failing. She'd started therapy. That part surprised even her. The therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dana, didn't offer blame or cheap comfort. She just listened. Then she asked questions that made Emily squirm. When did you first feel like you needed something more than what Alan gave you? What did it cost you to chase that feeling? Would you do it again if no one ever found out? And Emily hated that the answer wasn't no. She kept trying to write Alan a letter. The 5th attempt sat unfinished in her notebook. "Alan, there is no version of this where I come out clean. I know that. You gave me years of loyalty and stability. I gave you doubt. I was wrong. I was selfish. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I do hope someday you'll remember a piece of us as something good." She couldn't bring herself to send it. He was living his life now. Rebuilding. Why dig up ashes? One night, she sat in her sister's kitchen, sipping tea while the dishwasher hummed. Her sister, Michelle, watched her quietly. "You know what I don't get?" Michelle said finally. "You had a man who showed up every single day. He adored you. He'd cook dinner when you were too tired. He packed your lunch like it was a love letter. What happened?" Emily looked at her tea. "I don't know. I think I just wanted to feel wanted again. Like I mattered. You mattered to him. You were his whole world." "I know," Emily whispered. "And that's the worst part." Back at the apartment, Alan had just finished his latest book club read, something about resilience and letting go. Fitting. He liked the group. None of them knew his story and he didn't offer it. But he liked that they called him thoughtful. Said he listened more than most. He wasn't planning to date. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But there was a woman at the book club who made him laugh. Not in a flirtatious way, just honest amusement. She had a crooked tooth and wore oversized scarves and talked about books like they were people she'd met at parties. Alan didn't feel ready. But he didn't feel broken either. And that felt like something. Alan never planned on seeing Emily again. That wasn't bitterness talking. Just self-preservation. Like taking your hand off a hot stove. Not because you hate the stove, but because you finally learned. And healing? It meant not going back to burn yourself all over again. It had been almost 3 months. Enough time for routines to settle. For the ache to become background noise. He worked. Hiked. Read. Got pretty good at cooking meals for 1, 2. Not that he didn't miss having someone across the table, but he'd started liking his own company more than he expected. He'd also gotten closer to someone from the book club. Her name was Rowan. Mid-30s, warm laugh, worked in publishing, and never asked about his past. That alone made him want to stick around. They walked out together after meetings, sometimes grabbed coffee, sometimes just talked. It was slow, intentional, nothing official but something alive. Alan told himself he was okay. Maybe he even believed it. Then, one Sunday afternoon, while walking through a local artisan market with Rowan, sipping iced chai and debating whether or not beeswax candles were a scam, he saw her. Emily. She was at a stall across the way, standing still, holding a jar of something she wasn't really looking at. Her hair was shorter, her posture a little slouched, like the weight hadn't quite come off her shoulders. But it was her. And for a split second the world narrowed. She hadn't seen him yet. Rowan was mid-sentence when she noticed the change in his face. "Hey, you okay?" Alan took a deep breath, eyes still on the woman who once shared his last name. "Yeah, just saw a ghost." He didn't walk over. He didn't wave. And he didn't run. He simply turned slightly, enough to guide Rowan toward a different aisle. He didn't need closure. He'd already given it to himself. But something about seeing her, here now, made things feel strangely final. Like the last page of a chapter that no longer needed rewriting. Meanwhile, Emily had seen him. She didn't think he noticed. She watched him turn, watched the woman at his side laugh. A soft, easy laugh. It hit her harder than anything else had. Not because she was jealous, but because it looked real, peaceful, earned. And Alan looked free. She didn't approach. She knew better. Dana, her therapist, would have told her to write it down instead. So that night she did. "I saw him today. He looked happy. Like the version of him I only got in pieces toward the beginning. I didn't realize what that freedom would look like on his face. I don't hate it. I'm glad for him. But there's something cruel about seeing what someone becomes after you lose them. Especially when you know you helped create the version they had to escape from." Emily was doing better, too, in her own way. She'd gone back to work part-time, teaching literacy at a community center. Not the same as her old job, but close enough to feel useful again. She still lived with Michelle, though they were looking at apartments together. Her therapist said healing wasn't linear, and some days that felt true. Other days it just felt like a nice thing people say. She didn't chase Alan anymore. Didn't draft letters or look for him in every crowd. But every so often, she'd pass someone wearing a flannel shirt and feel a tug in her ribs. Regret is a strange thing. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just sits quietly at the kitchen table, sipping your coffee. But she wasn't trying to win him back. Not anymore. Because somewhere along the way, Emily stopped asking for the old life back, and started asking herself what kind of woman she wanted to be now. And Alan? He kept walking. Not away. Just forward. Alan didn't talk much about the past. Not because he was hiding anything, but because he'd learned something strange about healing. When you retell the story too many times, you start to live in it again. And he wasn't going backward. But Rowan was different. Not nosy. Not prying. Just present. She knew he had an ex-wife. She didn't ask why they split. Not at first, and he didn't offer. But one night, walking back from dinner after a small poetry reading at the library, she finally asked the question that had been floating between them for weeks. "Do you ever miss her?" Alan paused. They were passing under the yellow glow of a street lamp, and the pause didn't feel defensive, just deliberate. "I miss who I thought she was," he said. "But I think I miss who I was even more." Rowan nodded. "That's honest." They didn't dissect it further. And that, oddly enough, made Alan feel safer with her than any hours-long therapy session ever could. They kept seeing each other. Slow, gentle, no pressure. She introduced him to her dog, an aging beagle named Hugo who had more opinions than most people Alan knew. Alan started leaving a toothbrush at her place, then a drawer. Then he realized one night, while she was asleep beside him, that the ache he'd carried for so long wasn't there anymore. Not replaced, just finally gone. Across town, Emily signed a lease for a small apartment. It was nothing special, but it was hers. The first space she'd had in years that didn't carry someone else's scent, memories, or expectations. She painted the walls a pale green, put a bookshelf by the window, started collecting plants she wasn't sure she could keep alive. She also started journaling more. Her therapist had encouraged it from day one, but only now did it feel like something more than homework. She wrote about her guilt, yes, but also about her hopes. Her fears. Her craving for purpose. One entry stood out. "I used to think redemption came when someone forgave you. Now I think it comes when you finally stop lying to yourself." She didn't look for Alan anymore. Didn't hope to bump into him. She knew that if their paths ever did cross again, it wouldn't be about reconnection. It would be about recognition, two people who once built a life, then walked away from it so they could rebuild themselves. One night, while organizing a community book drive, Emily found herself laughing with a man named Jonah. He was a volunteer, mid-40s, wore faded jeans and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He loved old westerns and hated technology. There was no electricity in the air. No fireworks. Just calm. And after everything, calm felt revolutionary. They went for coffee a few times. Talked about books, loss, what it meant to start over at this stage of life. She didn't tell him about Alan right away. Didn't tell him about the island, the betrayal, the silence. Not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't need that to define her anymore. Somewhere between the third and fourth date, she realized she hadn't checked Alan's social media in over a month. She didn't need to. Because the truest measure of healing isn't whether you get back what you lost. It's whether you learn how to want something better. And both of them, Alan with Rowan, Emily with her own name again, were finally doing just that. The end didn't come with fireworks. No dramatic phone call. No sobbing reunions or angry confrontations. It just faded. Like fog lifting slowly from a field until one day both Alan and Emily could finally see where they stood. And it wasn't next to each other. Alan woke up on a Saturday morning and realized he hadn't thought about Emily in days. Not out of anger. Not from repression. Just peace. A kind of quiet that settles over you when the war is finally over. The air smelled like pine. The sky was overcast. He liked mornings like this, unpolished, a little sleepy. He rolled out of bed and walked barefoot to the kitchen where Rowan was already brewing coffee. She looked up from the mug she was pouring and offered a sleepy smile. "You snore less when you're happy," she said. "That's because I'm no longer suffocating on unspoken feelings," he replied with a smirk. It was the kind of humor Rowan understood. Not cruel. Just true. They packed that morning for a weekend trip to the lake. No itinerary, no pressure. Just space to breathe and time to let the silence speak. Hugo, the old beagle, shuffled into the back seat like a grumpy chaperone. Alan kissed Rowan's temple before starting the engine. He didn't feel like someone rebuilding. He felt like someone who had already built something, and this time he'd laid the foundation with honesty. Meanwhile, across town, Emily stood in front of her full-length mirror, not to check her outfit, but to see if she recognized herself. She did. Not the woman she used to be, the one who wore distraction like perfume and mistook attention for affection, but someone different. Steadier. A little softer around the edges, maybe, but more solid at the core. Jonah would be arriving soon. They had plans to volunteer at a local garden project. Nothing glamorous. Nothing romantic. Just pulling weeds, planting seeds, sharing gloves and sunburns. The kind of thing that didn't feel like a date but always ended with the kind of silence you didn't need to fill. She liked that he didn't ask about her past too often. She liked even more that when he did, he listened without trying to fix it. Earlier that week, she'd gone through her closet and finally donated the box she'd been avoiding, the one with her wedding dress, old photos, anniversary cards. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She just walked it to the donation center, let the box go, and walked out lighter. It was never about forgetting Alan. It was about remembering herself. That evening, Alan and Rowan sat by the lake, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun dip beneath the trees. He reached for her hand and she took it without looking. No ceremony. No performance. Just presence. And somewhere, under the same sky, Emily and Jonah shared a quiet moment, sitting on a park bench, their sleeves streaked with dirt, their laughter low and unforced. Two people who broke. Two people who healed. Apart. Some stories don't end with reunion. They end with renewal. There are moments that don't ask for attention but stay with you anyway. For Alan, it was the breeze at the lake that last morning. Not the wind, not the chill, just the breeze. Gentle. Steady. Like the world exhaling. He stood by the water while Rowan packed up their things, Hugo already tucked in the back seat snoring softly. Alan skipped a stone across the surface, and when it made 5 skips instead of 3, he smiled. That was enough. It had been 6 months since the Maldives. 6 months since the note. Since the silence. Since the reset. He hadn't planned to ever see Emily again, and maybe he still wouldn't. But that morning, as he stared out over the water, he thought of her without the usual weight. No sharpness. Just a name that once lived in his home and now lived in a different chapter. One he had already read. He and Rowan drove back in mostly silence, the good kind. The kind you only get when no one's pretending. When they got back, he checked the mailbox. Bills. Coupons. And one envelope without a return address. He knew the handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper. No melodrama. No desperation. Alan, this isn't a request. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for loving me when I didn't even love myself. For seeing me even when I was invisible to myself. You deserve better. And I'm becoming better not because I think you'll ever come back, but because I finally want to be. Wherever you are now, I hope it's quiet and kind. Goodbye. Emily. Alan read it once. Then again. Then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't cry. Didn't clutch his chest. Didn't call anyone. He walked out to the porch, sat in his favorite chair, and watched the sky go from blue to orange. A breeze moved through the trees. He whispered goodbye like a prayer, not a wound. Meanwhile, Emily was walking home from the garden center. Her hands smelled like lavender and dirt. She carried a tiny clay pot with a tomato sprout Jonah had helped her transplant. Her apartment key jingled in her pocket. A small thing, but hers. The letter she'd sent felt like closure. Not for him, for her. She didn't expect a reply. Didn't want one, really? The point wasn't to open a door. It was to close one with grace. That night, she lit a candle in the corner of her kitchen, one of those cheap ones that smelled like sea breeze and hope. She watered the tomato plant, then stood by her window and watched the stars come out one by one. No music. No background noise. Just stillness. And sometimes stillness is the best kind of ending. Because healing isn't about making everything right again. It's about making peace with the fact that not everything will be.